Hello again, everybody. This is Mr. Everything. I'm coming at you with another Let's Talk video. Now, this video we're going to talk about a game that I played back in the 70s and early 80s called The Fantasy Trip. I know it sounds kind of trippy, right? The Fantasy Trip. Well, or TFT, right? And so The Fantasy Trip was a Steve Jackson game. You know who Steve Jackson is. He's the creator of Munchkin and Ogre and GURPS and a variety of other games out there, right? He made a game when he was working with a company called Metagaming. They made this role-playing game called The Fantasy Trip. It was different than Dungeons and Dragons. Dungeons and Dragons in 77 was starting to become very popular. Traveler was becoming popular at that time. The Fantasy Trip was becoming popular. A lot of early role-playing games got their start in the late 70s. Okay, and that's when I started gaming, was in the late 70s. I got talked into playing D&D, Dungeons and Dragons, by my cousin. Okay, so we went and saw the Lord of the Rings. If you remember the old rotoscoped Lord of the Rings, I was like a kid, right? But I'm like super excited about it. I was like 13 years old. I'm like super excited, like, ooh, this is really cool, blah, 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 blah. And he goes, hey, you know what? We played this role-playing game called Dungeons and Dragons, and it's just like the Lord of the Rings. I mean, you could be an elf. You know, you could be a dwarf, whatever. And I was like, ooh, that sounds cool. So when I moved back home to New Orleans, I went to the local hobby shop and said, hey, you guys got D&D? They did. And I was like, ooh, cool. And then I looked at the shelf as well, and they had other games like The Fantasy Trip. And they also had Traveler. And those were the games that I latched onto. Those are the three games I really latched onto. And what's funny about The Fantasy Trip was it didn't get started as a role-playing game. It got started as, if you remember back in the day, and I mean the 70s, games, there was a phenomenon where games would come out in Ziploc bags, right? And these Ziploc bags were, this 4x6 or whatever, and you would open it up and you would play a game like, there was a game out there called, it had something to do with, it was Star Trek. I'm trying to remember it wasn't Starfleet Battles. Maybe it was Starfleet Battles, but it came out in a small box or small Ziploc bag size, 4x6 kind of packaging. And The Fantasy Trip was no exception. It came out originally as a game called Melee. Get out my book of everythings. It came out as a game called The Fantasy Trip Melee. Right here. This is Melee. And what that was nothing more than you make a guy, I make a guy, we go into arena combat, and we 3d6, I roll to hit, you roll to hit, we roll to damage, we roll damage, and you move around on a little hex map, and the hex map's like this big. What I found cool about Melee was, and I did this daily, every day while I was in high school, I brought it to high school with me. It was in my backpack, when lunchtime hit, we'd go run, grab our lunch, we'd eat it, and we'd go out to the little foyer area, and we'd throw down some Melee, and we would roll against each other, and we would do a couple of battles, and then we'd go back to class, right? And that's all it took. It only took like 5-10 minutes to play a game of Melee. And we got good at it. We were like, because it's like the easiest game in the universe, because I don't know, I'll have to do a video on explaining what the Fantasy Trip is. But this video is not about that. I'm just kind of giving you a little backstory. I'm sorry, I'm like digressing and going in a different direction. But the Fantasy Trip was originally a Steve Jackson game. Melee was his first game, and it was warriors battling it out. It took you less than 1 minute to make a character. I mean, if you knew the rules, you could make a character in like 1 minute, or you could, if you didn't know the rules, it would probably take you less than 5 minutes to learn the rules to be able to make a character. It was that easy, right? You had 2 stats, strength and dexterity. That was it, right? Your strength determined how big of a weapon you could wield, and it also said how many hit points you had. If you got 18 strength, you got 18 hit points. You got 15 strength, you got a 15 hit points. Done. And then dexterity was, to hit me, you had to roll higher than my dexterity. That's it, right? So if I have a 10 dexterity, you got to roll a 10 or better on 3d6 to hit me. And that was pretty much the whole game. I mean, yeah, you had armor and you had weapons, and different weapons did different things, and you had like hex movement, and there were races, like you could be an elf or a dwarf, but that didn't change the mechanics of the game. That just changed what your numbers were on strength and dex. And then a normal human, if I'm going memory, 77 memory, you had like an 8 strength, an 8 dex, and you added 8 points to where you wanted. So you could have up to a 16 strength, right? You could have up to a 16 dex. Couldn't have both, right? You don't roll the dice and get 2 18s. No, it's not that way. So you point allotted, and it was 1 for 1. So if I wanted a 14 strength, I could have a 10 dex or whatever, and then it would work its way up from there. So you had to decide if getting hit was more important, or having more hit points was more important, or being able to do more damage because you had a stronger strength was more important. And because dex is super important, because if you don't get hit, you don't take damage, right? But having a higher strength was important because you could deal more damage when you did hit. Wait, did you roll less than your own dex to hit? Or did you? Yeah, I think that's correct. I don't remember. I think it was you had to roll less than your own dexterity to hit. Okay. So you had to decide if you wanted to hit hard or if you wanted to hit more often, softer, or something like that. And that was the game. That was it. You moved around a little map, and you had these little counters, these little tokens. Some people would use miniatures, when you got at home, I would use miniatures, but in school, I'd just take the Ziploc bag and I'd go, right? Well, they came out like shortly thereafter, a game called Wizard, right? And you're like, oh, Wizard, cool. It used exactly the same rules as Melee, except they added 1 stat, intelligence. So you had a strength, you had a dex, and now you had intelligence. And intelligence for a wizard told you how complicated of a spell you could cast, right? So a wizard with like an 8 intelligence is not casting very complicated spells, but a wizard with a 16 intelligence was casting fireball or whatever. He was casting something more powerful, summoning the bigger dragons instead of just a dog or something like that. So wizards had to sacrifice their strength and their dexterity to get a better intelligence. And I think it went 8, 8, 8 with 8 points to add at that point, right? So now, like if you were an elf, you'd start with a 10 intelligence or a 10 dex, I don't remember, and like maybe a 6 strength or something, because there was always give and take. So what that meant was nobody was better than anybody else. You didn't have a character out there that was better than another character because everyone had the same number of points. So I got 24 points, you've got 24 points, period. You're an elf? Okay, well that just means you can modify your points up or down by 1 or 2, so it allowed dwarves to have an 18 strength because they would start at 10 with that 18 points, with that 8 to add, right? So they could have an 18 strength, but then their decks would be shitty, right? And then when the wizards came out, it made a couple modifications. Now, what Wizard also did was introduce skills. So you could learn, instead of spells, you could learn a certain number of skills based on what your intelligence was. So having a higher intelligence meant you got more skill points to spend, and then there would be more complicated skills. And these, so basically Wizard was kind of like Melee 2.0, right? Because it made the game a little bit more complicated, but you could still finish a game in less than 10 minutes. You have a wizard, I got a warrior, doesn't matter. We both have wizard, doesn't matter. We both have warriors, no big deal. And then this is the topic of the subject here. They came out with this. We're not going to talk about Advanced Melee and Advanced Wizard because that came out a day later. But you had this game called, well, it's not a game. You had this book called In the Labyrinth. And what that did was it allowed you to take your melee character, your warrior, or your wizard from Wizard, team up and go through a dungeon, right? Like you do, right? And so In the Labyrinth introduced all these monsters and traps and money to buy stuff and like treasures and magic items, and basically it turned the fantasy trip into a role-playing game, because now you don't have to have a referee. You could play with your friends with no referee, because they created these certain adventures that were self-driven. Basically, you could go, when you went into a room, it said, this is what's in the room, and there's a door over there, there's a door over there, there's a door over there. Which one do you pick, right? And so when you pick that door, it's kind of like a choose your own adventure kind of thing, and it tells you, but they really wanted those to be solo quests, but you could do that with your friends, especially Grail Quest. I thought that was a pretty cool one. Grail Quest put you in the role of a Knight of the Round Table kind of thing. And then you were on the quest for the Holy Grail. And there are other adventures out there too, Death Test and stuff like that. Okay. So, I'm playing D&D with my friends. And one of my best friends, I've got in high school, there was like 3 or 4 of us that were tight, right? And we would play all kinds of role-playing games together and stuff like that. He was like, D&D is so broke. There are so many different rules in D&D that make the game just unbalanced or unrealistic. There's no rhyme or reason why this is happening. And I'm like, no, man, D&D. I was super popular. I was super hyped for D&D. And he's like, no, man, you need to check out this game called The Fantasy Trip. And I was like, yeah, I saw it on the shelf and never bought it. Okay, I'll check it out. Oh my God, it was awesome, right? But now remember, I'm playing first edition AD&D. There's a million rules in AD&D. Your character and my character could be way out of balance. I could have like this I could have rolled all 18s on all my stats, and you could have rolled all 3s on all your stats, and your character would never be as good as my character, no matter how much stuff you got, right? So it really was kind of unbalanced, right? But the fantasy trip was everyone had the same abilities. The monsters were pretty deadly. They were pretty deadly. Your character could die in the fantasy trip. There's no death saves. When you're dead, you're dead, right? And so, but it seemed like the wizards were way more powerful than they were in D&D. In D&D, there was a gradual progression of character levels. There was a lot more options, if you want to say that. Let me back up and not say that, because you had classes in D&D, as you know. It hasn't changed. There's classes. So you got fighter, cleric, thief, elf. Those were classes, right? So you could be one of those classes, and you would have your abilities, right? This is what you would have. Well, in the fantasy trip, it's not like that. In the fantasy trip was, I'm a fighter, and if I want to learn to be a rapier, if I want to learn how to fight with a rapier, I can't. You spend my skill points. If I want to learn how to be an archer, I can. I just learn how to use a bow. If I want to be really good at being an archer, I learn expert bowman. Or if I want to learn how to read, I spend a point on reading, and so, or additional languages or whatever. So it was more open-ended. So your character wasn't locked into a class, except for if you want to lock yourself in a class, you can't. But in D&D, each character was pretty much locked in and predetermined what kind of abilities you're going to have based on what your level is. One good thing about that, so that's a good thing about the fantasy trip. But I felt that the wizards in the fantasy trip really got the short end of the stick in the fact that one hit, he's dead, right? But his spells were so powerful. So it was like, if you want to be a wizard, you can be a wizard. You can do a ton of damage, but if I hit you, you are freaking dead. It's one of those where the warrior could take a few hits and he could give out a few hits. So he's more of a balanced character, where the wizard was just max extremes. And that's cool. I like that, but I also disliked it at the same time, But when John Patterson put his name out, boom, he put me through the fantasy trip, and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is an awesome set of rules. I fell in love with it. I said, you know what? You are right. D&D first edition is so broke and backwards ass game. I mean, it's popular and people love D&D, but they don't really know anything about the fantasy trip. And the fantasy trip was metagaming at the time, was not a big publisher like TSR was, right? They put out some games like a game that I still own. Oh man, I play not Masters of Orion, because I think that's where that was based on. It was called Conquest, Galaxy Conquest. Galaxy Conquest, Conquest, something. Either way, you're colonizing planets and stuff in the game. And that was like the super popular game at the time, in my area anyway. And the fantasy trip just didn't really catch on, people, because I have a feeling that it didn't catch on because the production quality was kind of low. It was in a Ziploc bag. I mean, where D&D was putting out hardback books. So I think the production quality was a little low. The monsters didn't have pictures. It was all text, like somebody got on their word processor and they typed up, text descriptions. And it was like courier font, and it just, it took a little bit more imagination and a little bit more, it wasn't as flashy, like the player's handbook or the monster manual in D&D had pictures and cartoons and little diagrams, and the fantasy trip had none of that, right? It was all, you just have to be a smart person to play this game, right? It's like, if you can't figure it out, then you don't need to be playing this game, even though it's super easy, right? And that's probably what they were relying on. I'm just thinking outside the box. Because it was so easy, they said, well, it's so easy, we don't need to put any pictures on there. And if we pay artists, it's going to make it cost more and blah, blah, blah. Because I think I bought the fantasy strip for like $7, Each book, like Melee was $7, Wizard was $7, In the Labyrinth might have been $12 or something. Yeah, so I have a referee screen somewhere I'll show you. Okay, I'll get back to this. I don't want to spend my whole video talking about the fantasy trip. Actually, let me back up. I don't want to spend the whole video talking about my experience with the fantasy trip. What I meant to do is talk about something that's really cool, and that's the Kickstarter that just kicked off. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about why there's a Kickstarter for the fantasy trip. Steve Jackson, you know him, big publisher. Steve Jackson Games made all kinds of cool things, right? when he was in metagaming, he left metagaming. Metagaming kept the fantasy trip with some other people working on it. But it was really Steve Jackson's baby. But he couldn't take it with him because Metagaming was a publisher and they owned it, right? Well, Metagaming folded. Right? When they folded, the license to the fantasy trip didn't go to Steve Jackson. He wasn't the owner, right? He might have been the designer, but he wasn't the owner of the fantasy trip. Metagaming was. And they had no plans to let it go. 35 years later, right? I don't know, 80 to whatever it is. 37 years later? 37 years later, or whatever it is, Steve Jackson was able to get the fantasy trip back in his pocket, right? If you've ever played GURPS, right? If you ever played the generic universal role-playing system, GURPS, right? It got its life from, and it feels a lot like the fantasy trip. Unfortunately, GURPS loses something by being multi-genre, right? So I've got GURPS Traveler on the shelf right there, right? That's GURPS Traveler. And I love Traveler. So I said, you know what? I like the fantasy trip. Let's get GURPS because it's GURPS. You know, GURPS is the fantasy trip just modified. No, too many rules. There's too many rules in GURPS. I was like, man, I don't really like this. This kind of sucks. So, but when I remember about the fantasy trip it was specifically fantasy. So you're looking at warriors and wizards and dragons. And so he decided to kick off this Kickstarter. Now let me switch to my monitor with the Kickstarter on it. Okay, right there. So you see that he's got Kickstarter and he's got the fantasy trip. Old school role playing, right? The fantasy trip. We're not going to play the video. He only wanted $20,000 to start this project. He figured that if he gets $20,000, he'll be able to put out Melee and Wizard and maybe in the Labyrinth and go from there, right? Just reprint everything, basically. And as you can tell, as of Wednesday, the 25th, this is only 2 days into the backing, because I think this kicked off on the 23rd, and it still only has 29 days. It still has a full 29 days left to go, because it was 30 just a few minutes ago. Now it's 29, so it must have kicked off, at like 6 o'clock. They've already got 500% of what they need. No, yeah, over 500%, right? And there's already 1,300 backers, right? There he is. He's holding it up. That's the old books, In the Labyrinth and Tolkienar's, something like that. Tolkienar's Lair. That's one of the big campaign books that they made for the fantasy trip. So he now has the rights to it. And instead of putting the books out the exact same as they used to be, with just black and white, with no pictures and no graphics, and being very, very under the table, they've decided to go ahead and step it up. And these are all a bunch of comments about what he used to make. At the beginning of my career, long before GURPS, he created a role-playing game for the fantasy trip, right? And then right here, the fantasy trip only lasted from 77 to 82. Okay, so it lasted till 82. Okay, that's cool. That's why they say 35 years. He started the fantasy trip. It even rivaled D&D in popularity at the time. He wanted to make it a more playable fantasy role-playing game, because D&D at the time was kind of complicated, right? I mean, the 5th edition today learned a lesson from the fantasy trip. In the more accessible you make the game, the more players you'll get. And so 5th edition is a lot easier, less rules, a lot more streamlined. And that's what the fantasy trip was back in 1977. Okay, scrolling down. Melee came out in 77. Wizard came out in 78. Oh, look at that. It was being sold for $3. So I was wrong. I must have paid $7 for the whole set, right? And they called those micro games, right? Micro games were in these little Ziploc bags that I was talking about. And then now they're Death Test 2. Those are like solo adventures that you could play with your friends or by yourself. And then there's Advanced Melee, Advanced Wizard. Those came out in the 80s. And then In the Labyrinth came out in the 80s. And that's when the role-playing kicked off. Because between 77 and 80, it was just the individual arena combat thing. And then Tolkien's Lair, which I don't own. I've never owned that module. That's one reason why I'm really considering backing this game instead of just running out and buying the game. I think I'm going to back it, but I'll talk. And that's what this video is about, is the Kickstarter, really. So the Fantasy Trip continued with metagaming, and then it's been unavailable for 40 years, nearly 40 years, 35 years. But you can see now that they've got these couple of box arts right here for Melee and Wizard. And these are going to be small games as well, small little booklet style boxes. But they're going to add... Okay, this is it. This is the Legacy Edition, right? That's what you're bidding on or backing. You get In the Labyrinth, you get Melee, the box set for Melee, and then you get the box set for Wizard, and there's stretch goals. And then right now, if you could back for as low as just $10 if you want. But $30 right here, this reward, you'll get a PDF of all the rules. And that's a lot. That's just enough for everybody, right? I mean, you can, and it looks like the March of 2019 is when that's going to be released. That's soon, to me, that's like 6 months from now. But I don't think he has to rewrite the game, even though he is rewriting it. He's got an old editor that used to work at Metagaming coming through, and he's going to help him edit it. And I'm looking down for a name right here, Guy McLemore. He worked on the Fantasy Trip back in the day of Metagaming, and he just got him to join up with him and do some creative editing. And instead of the digital, I think I'm going to go for the $60 pledge because, or no, I'm not going to go for the $60 pledge. I lied. But in the $60 pledge, you got the Fantasy Trip Legacy Edition. You also get In the Labyrinth. Basically, you get everything that you should, but you're actually going to get a hard copy, right? And the PDF. And that I'm not. There's 600 people back that one, 89 people back that one, but this is the one right here, the 110 level. Yeah, the 110 level is where I think I'm going to go. It's called I Want It All. Basically, you get the PDF, of course. You get the box set with Melee, Wizard, and In the Labyrinth and Tolkien's Lair, but you get these play mats. 14 by 24 is really not that big. But it is a cool map to have. 24 is 2 feet. So it's like a little over a foot by 2 feet. And what that is, it's the Melee arena. And then the Wizard playmat was more of a square. It's 2 foot by 2 foot. Now that is a pretty good size map, especially for Melee and Wizard. But you can always get additional. It plays on a hex map. So you can get a hex map and just play on that. And these are going to be writable, so you can write on them. And there's a specific mechanic in Melee and Wizard that uses what's called a mega hex, which you have the hex and the surrounding hexes around it is a mega hex. So those will probably be on those maps. I think I got a picture of that. And then if you're a retailer, like you own a store, you can actually pick up fairly inexpensively a 135 pledge will get you 3 copies of everything, right? And so I thought that was pretty cool. Or if you want to really put some money in, you can. Where are the maps at? Yeah, there's the maps. You got the Melee map. You see how these hexes here? That's a mega hex. And then you got your hex map, and then the Wizard one was like a little extra big, and then it had these darker megahexes for you to say that it's a bridge or to say that it's walls or caverns. But you can also print out these tiles that you can lay on here to make them like basically to cover up the hexes, to make them like puddle or a stalactites or whatever, right? And then the tokens were, and this, I felt like this was cheesy, but they still make them, right? They're going to remake them. And what they are, they're little square counters, are about 1 inch by inch, and they have a drawing of your character on there. You have like a couple of dozen to choose from, and you got letters on them. And so if you do mass combat, all you got to do is write the letter down of who's who. I think I still like miniatures better. That's just me. You can't really play miniatures with a circle, but you can. Hex would be better, but you need a front facing, and these squares gave you a front facing. And like these are like 3 hex creatures, like an ogre or something like that. And a dragon might look like that, where it would be this is what's called a 7 hex dragon. So you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 hexes, and like, yeah, all different kinds of characters and creatures. And they're working on stretch goals, at 22,000, Legacy, the Fantasy Trip, Melee, Wizard, a website with new slimes, new creatures. Death Test is going to be announced. It's a programmed adventure. And then you got 5 new plants, which, okay. And then some articles from an old Space Gamer magazine. That's going to help you do with the Fantasy Trip. And then you got 1 sheet of mega hexes, 2-sided dry erase. So basically, we're going to have a big map anyway. That's something that's unlocked. And then we'll be able to add a second programmed adventure, Death Test, and then the new website, which is open now actually. And then a sheet of mega hexes included with each Legacy Edition box. So we are waiting to hit that level. Wait, we're past that level, aren't we? Oh, we need 111. Okay, 110 or whatever it is. Okay, we're at 106. Okay, so we're almost there. And then a pad of wizard character sheets. Basically, a character sheet is the same size as a playing card. A character sheet is only 2.5 by 3.5 inches. So, yeah. So, I don't know if they... Oh, yeah, right here. It looks just like that. So, 2.5 by 3.5. See, all you need is strength, dex, and IQ. Movement allowance? Maybe that's movement. This is your weapon. This is your armor. Keep track of your hit points down here. Make a name. That's it. You're done. Maybe put a character, like a drawing of your character or your letter or something on there. So, yeah. Now, on the back side, I guess you could put your skills. That'd be super easy to do. Yeah. So the guy's making the mats is Dyson Logos right here. He's making these mats, and he's making them out of, I think he's making them out of they're going to be plastic maps, basically. Large play maps. They're supposed to be, you're supposed to be able to dry erase on them or write on them, maybe water or something, but you're going to be able to write on them. Here we are. Does it say? Nope. Okay. But that's what I understand. So I'm thinking about getting this 110 right here. I'm going to get everything I need, plus all the stretch goals, and I'll have it. Now, my understanding is the rules are not going to change. It's going to be the same old game. So if you have any of the old modules or any of the old adventures and you just want to get a newer, updated version of the Fantasy Trip, you certainly can. All right, now before I go, I wanted to kind of show you a little bit about my collection of the Fantasy Trip. I already showed you a little bit of this, but I've got the Fantasy Trip Melee already right here, you can see. And this is the little micro game blown up. So it's not, it used to be only like this big, right? But this has been blown up and printed. And you can see the kind of art that was in it wasn't impressive, right? I mean, black and white pencil art is not. And then there's Wizard, and you can see the ink on my printer was dying when I printed that out. But there's a couple of things that you might really like. Okay, this is Wizard and all the spells made into a spell table. Monster Beast table. Then there's Melee and Wizard mass combat charts. So if you have like an army or something. And then there's a lot of this is downloaded from forums. Because that's like a mass combat house rule. And then there's... Wait, where are we at? That's the mass combat stuff. We'll get there. We'll get there. In the Labyrinth, right? And so in the Labyrinth is this is the role-playing version of the game, but it needs to be updated. It really does. There's a few holes that any good referee could fill on their own. But, okay, here we go. Something cool. There we go. Mega hexes, right? Now, these are mega hexes that you would cut out, and you can photocopy. Permission? They give you permission to photocopy it. No, but you could copy this and then cut them out and then draw on them like whatever. And then when you put them on the map, you can rearrange them however you want. And this is kind of a world dungeon. Think Underdark, right? But they give you the map, but they don't fill the rooms. They let you do that. And then more different shapes of megahexes. Okay. And that was all in the Labyrinth. And there's all your weapon charts. And for some reason, I have a GURPS character sheet on here. And here's some tokens. These are all black and white. Obviously, well, blue and white, actually. But, yeah. So if you wanted to just get started, you could. Like, there's a snake and a bear and little weapons. Because sometimes you'll drop your weapon, so they give extra weapons. There's some wolves. Yeah, and there's character sheets right there. Okay, so I've had this for a while, sitting on the shelf, not really wanting to play it or have any desire to put any of my players through it. But I was speaking to Mike today, and he was like, "Oh man, check out the Kickstarter for the fantasy trip, man. You're gonna love it and all that." And I was like, "You play the fantasy trip? I didn't know you played the fantasy trip." But okay, going to my Manila folder. This has got all the esoteric things in it. One of them is the fantasy trip referee screen. I got a fantasy trip referee screen. How long have I had that? 35 years. Okay. There's Advanced Wizard. You can see it's better printing. Same deal. Advanced. And then there's should be Advanced Melee in here too. I don't see it. But then there's somebody wrote an article about superheroes in the fantasy trip. So you could play like a superhero. But that's not what I was getting at. Okay, 7 of 10, 10 of 10. Okay, then they go to high-tech fantasy trip. Interesting. Here we go. The fantasy trip Traveler. I can play the fantasy trip Traveler. I might even do that because I love Traveler, and I really did like the fantasy trip. Okay, there's my Advanced Melee. Okay, that's in there. What's after that? There's got to be something else after that. A bunch of blank pages. No, that's not right. Actually, there are a bunch of blank pages. What's that? Outdoor encounters? No, okay. A Labyrinth Index. Okay, so I already have quite a bit of the fantasy trip, but you can see this isn't great production value. This is just photocopies. So if they send me just, that's why I'm not going to get just PDFs, because I already got that, right? Even though a PDF might be better if I printed it or something, but not into that. I want hard copies. I want hard copies. So I want the mats, and I want, you know, the box and the dice and the counters and the, you know, I want the full experience. I want to have it all. So I think I'm gonna do the 110. Yeah. So what I might do when it comes out, this is future, when it comes out, or between now and then, I don't know, I might do some videos on how to play the fantasy trip. Probably not. All right. So, but if you're interested in something like that, let me know in the comments below. If you want me to explain certain rules, or if you want me to walk you through the basics of Melee or something like that, if you have any questions, put them in the comments below. I will read those, and I will try to accommodate you. So if you want to, because I always look for reasons to make a video. So if you want me to do a certain type of video, just tell me and I'll probably do it. All right, guys. I need to get into the Kickstarter and start backing. All right, guys. So I'll catch you next time.